We had a Bible study last night in our home, and some guys came and they asked me a very important question. They're young believers, very zealous, and they said, you know, if I do something out of just sheer obedience, but I don't feel anything, I'm not moved by love, I'm not moved by any sense of affection toward God, I'm just doing it because it's obedience, should I do it? And I said, absolutely. We are called to obey God. We are called to obey God. Regardless of our disposition, regardless of what we are feeling, we are called to walk in obedience. But we got talking, and one of them said, you know, you need to put this on film. So here I am. I'm going to put it on film here for a few minutes. And I would like to talk to you, especially you young believers, about loving God and about obedience and how those two things go together. Now, first of all, let's talk about how do we grow in our love for God. You know, when I was a young believer, I was keenly aware of the fact that I needed to grow in my love for God. And my question was, how? You know? And I'm still aware of that. As long as we're walking here on this planet, we're going to have a need to be loving God. And when I was young, what we would do, you know, you would go to these meetings or go to revivals or go to some conference, and it was all very excitable. You know, the preaching was very good, the music was very good, you were around other believers, and it seemed like, you know, your love for God would increase, at least your zeal. But then after a couple of days, you know, after the conference is over, you find that you're kind of back in the same place. And I knew that wasn't right. But, you know, how do we grow in our love for God? I mean, in a biblical way, in a way that's really going to remain. Well, I'd like to share that with you. And I find that Romans 12, verse 1 and 2 is very, very helpful in this matter. Let me just read it. Paul says, I urge you, brethren, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Now, do you see here, Paul is asking the greatest thing he could possibly ever ask of a person, to offer their life as a sacrifice. Not to another man, not to the church or some ecclesiastical organization, but to offer their lives as a living sacrifice to God. Now, what could be strong enough to motivate a human being to literally give their life away, the most precious thing they possess, to give their life away for the sake of God, in the name of God? Well, Paul tells us here, actually. It's embedded here in this verse. He says, therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God. He's urging them to give their life away by the mercies of God. Now, what are those mercies? Well, actually, Paul has spent the first 11 chapters in the book of Romans explaining what those mercies are. He starts off in Romans 1 through 3. Generally, we can say that he's talking about the radical depravity of man, that we are sinners, that we are enemies of God, that we deserve God's wrath. But then he gets to 4 and 5, and he talks about the salvation, the mercies of God in Jesus Christ, what God has done for us in the person and work of Christ, and how that is the greatest revelation of His love, of His mercy, of His grace. And then he goes on, and in chapters 6, 7, and 8, he tells us how to live the Christian life, even in the midst of struggling with sin, how to live the Christian life, and how we will come out of this thing victorious because of the one who's working in us, this glorious and mighty God. And then he gets to chapters 9, 10, and 11, and he's talking about not just Israel. People misunderstand this, but the whole relationship between Israel and the Gentile nations, and how God is evangelizing or doing a redemptive work in the whole planet with all peoples. And in the end, we come to the conclusion that He is a great and a faithful God. So, what are we saying? How do we grow in our devotion to God? How do we grow in our self-sacrifice? How do we grow in our love for God? The answer is, the more we discover about God and the attributes, the excellencies, the beauties of God that are revealed in the Scriptures, and particularly through the gospel of Jesus Christ, the more we know who God is, the more our love will grow. Now let me explain to you how this works. The Bible teaches very, very clearly that a man is born with a heart that is turned against God. At best, it is cold as a stone. It's like an inanimate thing in its relationship with God. It wants nothing to do with God, and it does not respond to God, but it does respond to every sort of wicked stimuli. Well, that person, that unconverted, unregenerated person, the more they learn about the beauties, the excellencies of God, the more they'll hate Him. That's what Romans 7 is about. The more God's nature is revealed to a sinful man through the revelation of the law, the more that man is going to kick against that law because he hates God, he hates God's righteousness, he hates God's holiness, and he hates God's law. But if you're a Christian, you're not that man. If you're a Christian, your heart has been regenerated. It's been made new, and it has new affections. If you're truly a Christian, the more your heart learns about who God is, and especially what God has done for you in Christ, the more you learn that doctrine, the more you grasp that theological knowledge, what's going to happen is going to draw out of you your affections. And those affections are going to drive you to obedience. So, just think about it for a moment, especially you young believers. How little believers actually study the attributes and works of God. How little preaching we hear on the attributes and works of God. Now I think we're beginning to understand why people, even God's people, are so dull in their love for God. Is there so little knowledge of God? We don't grow in our love for God. Well, let me put it this way. Imagine, I don't know if any of you studied physics, but let me just give you a little physics problem here. Let's say that I'm laying on the ground and flat on my back, and you look over there and you see me laying on the ground, and then you see me grab a hold with two hands, my two hands. You see me grab my belt as I'm laying on the ground, and I start pulling up fiercely, even violently, on my belt. And you're kind of curious, so you walk over and you go, Brother Paul, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm trying to get up. And they go, what? I say, well, I'm trying to get up. I'm trying to get up. And you say, well, Brother Paul, have you ever studied physics? Because if you had studied physics, you would know that in order to get up that way by pulling on your belt, you have to be acted upon by an outside force that has the strength to lift you off the ground. You can't lift yourself off the ground. It's the proverbial, you can't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Do you see? That's what most believers are trying to do. They'll go to a conference or they'll read a book and they'll get all zealous and kind of like twisting up a wind-up toy, Just you go and you hear the wonderful music and all this thing and you just get so twisted up and wound up, and the problem is, though, it just runs down really quick. It spins out, and in a few days all the maybe even boasts you made about how much you love God seem to come to nothing, just poof, like that. What you need is something else. And this is going to shock some of you young believers. You're going to sit there and go, oh my, that can't be true. What you need is theology. You say, well, I don't want any of that theology stuff. Well, just listen to what you're saying when you say that. Theology comes from the Greek word theos, which means God, and the Greek word logos, which is talking about a discourse or a word. When you say, I don't want any of that theology, Brother Paul, what you're saying is, I don't want to hear a word about God. I don't want to do a study about God. I don't want to listen to a discourse or read a discourse or dissertation on God. Well, if that's true about you, you've got a really big problem. Because if you know God as a Christian, then you're going to want to know more about Him. And that's what theology is about. Sometimes, young Christian, I hear people say this. They'll tell new believers, when you're reading the Bible, after you read a passage, ask yourself, what is this saying about you? What is this saying about you and what you need to do and who you are? That's the first thing you need to think about. No, it's not. That's not the first thing you need to think about at all. Matter of fact, that's the last thing you need to think about. When you